May I say, first of all, what a great delight it is to be here and to see Bishop Ray's base from which he operates, because, of course, I see him here, there, and everywhere, but it's good to see people at home, because I think that's where the real person is met with. And it's good to be here for that reason alone, and also, of course, to meet all of you and to work with you. When I was told by Bishop Ray and by Father Casey what the subject was going to be for this, well, extended weekend, I suppose it is, I thought to myself that the question of culture is very germane to this issue, because culture underlies, lies behind our relations as Christians with the state. And so I thought we would start discussion with culture before we go on to other questions about how we relate to the state, how Anglicanism has related to the state, and what the strengths and weaknesses of those relationships have been. It is said, isn't it, that if Jesus is Lord at all, he must be Lord of all. Lord of all. And that, of course, means Lord of culture. And so the question is, how is the Lordship of Christ recognized, acknowledged, fought for, if you like, in this or that culture, in this or that age? And that is what we're going to talk about. Now, we mustn't just assume what culture is. We must ask, what is culture? And there are different answers given to that question, are there not? For instance, some people would say that culture arises out of the human interaction with our environment, our natural environment. Others would say that culture is about social meaning, how a society has a worldview, what its values are, and how people live by them. Yet others would say that culture is about the non-biological heritage of humanity. The Second Vatican Council's Constitution Gaudium et Spes says that culture is about the exercise and the development of basic human faculties, human abilities of one kind or another, which give rise in their exercise and in their development to things like art, literature, architecture, I mean, all of the things that we associate with culture. Now, in all of these senses, we can, of course, say a massive yes to culture as something that is God-given, that is an expression, if you want, in theological language, of human beings being in God's image, made in God's image. It is an expression of that, and our study of culture must always, of course, have that in mind. But if culture is an expression of the cultural mandate in Genesis 1, and even of the family mandate in some ways, because families also come to be an expression of culture. If it is that, it is also an expression of the fallenness of humanity. It is not just that humanity is made in God's image, and so culture can only be said a yes to, in the sense that it is an expression of the fallenness of humanity. There is also a no that sometimes we have to say in the light of the Bible to this or that aspect of culture. So there is both a yes and a no here. Now, Charles Kraft, who is a well-known evangelical missiologist, wants to start with the positive. He has developed a view which he calls receptor-oriented evangelism. That is to say, that when we bear witness to the gospel, to our neighbors, to people in our society, we must look for those things that are an expression of the God-givenness of cultural beliefs and values. And he does acknowledge that the Christian faith seeks to transform culture, but he claims that this is always gradual and from the inside. Well, that's one way of looking at the missionary mandate. It is certainly the case that in the New Testament, the way in which the writers of the New Testament and the characters in the New Testament deal with the Hebrew scriptures can be seen in this way. So the way in which the testimonia that are cited again and again from the book of the prophet Isaiah, for instance, or from the Psalms, that is certainly what Kraft would call receptor-oriented evangelism. It is actually a way of using what is there already in the beliefs of a people to argue the case for Jesus being the Messiah. St. Paul, for instance, in his missionary journeys, when he goes to the synagogues, as he very usually does, uses this way of commending the gospel to his own kinsmen, the Jewish people. But there is, of course, another way of doing it. And this is seen when St. Paul, for instance, is talking not to the Jewish people, but to the Gentiles. So in the incident at Lystra, where he was almost forced to be worshipped. I mean, that's an interesting thing, isn't it? To be forced to be worshipped. And when he resists that attempt, he tells the people of Lystra that God has not left himself without witness anywhere, and appeals to their experience of the goodness of creation. Now, this kind of approach is developed, of course, in a definitive way in the encounter with the people of Athens, where there are a number of things that he acknowledges. He acknowledges, of course, as he does with the people of Lystra, the fact that the creation itself reveals the Creator. To the people of Athens, no less than to the Jewish people. The Creator itself reveals the Creator. The cultural artifacts and accomplishments of the Athenians also reveal the Creator. And of course, this is where his quotation from the pagan poets is a signal departure. In him we live and move and have our being was said first about Zeus. It is now applied to the God of the Bible. Howard Marshall, great New Testament scholar who's just died, tells us that already in the time of Paul, this passage was being used not so much to speak of Zeus, but to speak of the Logos by the Stoics. And then, of course, he acknowledges even their religiosity. Mistaken as it might have been, but nevertheless it does suggest that there was a seeking spirit among them. This or these approaches that we find in St. Paul's missionary journeys are actually also found in the sub-apostolic period. So if we consider, for instance, the first great apologist in the church, Justin Martyr, we find that in Justin's dialogue with Trypho the Jew, there is this constant appeal to the testimonia, to the way in which the Hebrew scriptures reveal the Messiah to be Jesus. But when Justin comes to his first apology to the Roman emperor and to the Roman Senate, the whole way of argument changes. It's no use now appealing to the Hebrew scriptures, because For the Romans, this would just have been some kind of barbarian superstition. So what does he do now? He now appeals to that principle of reason by which the universe is ordered, by which human life and human relationships are ordered, and which provides the moral structure for society. In other words, to the Logos. Justin is closely followed in this method by another great apologist, Clement of Alexandria, who describes the Logos as the music of the spheres. So this is now not just intellectual, but an artistic description. The harmony that is to be found in the universe is ascribed to the work and to the person of the Logos. Clearly, this is a positive way of evaluating culture as the early apologists found it, particularly in Hellenism. And so we find in the first few centuries there is the use of pagan philosophy by the apologists, clearly, particularly Stoic philosophy. There is even a use, as we find already in St. Paul, of pagan poetry. There is also a use of the morality, particularly of the Stoics. I mean, the obvious example to this are the household codes in Ephesians and Colossians. These were very fashionable to have codes of conduct for families in the pagan world. And as my old teacher, Professor Charlie Mole of Cambridge used to say, what distinguishes the Christian household codes is the emphasis on mutuality. So now it is not that all the duties lie on one side with wives and children and servants, and all the rights with the other side, that is to say husbands, fathers and masters, but there is a mutuality of rights and responsibilities on all sides. Nevertheless, there is a use here of something that was already being already current in the society around them. And there is even a use of pagan prophecy. I mean, this is quite astonishing, but the oracles of Sibyl, for instance, are used by the apologists to claim that they are about the coming of Jesus Christ. So that's the positive side, and there is a lot of it. But we should not imagine that the apologists were sanctioning pagan religion. You see, they are actually very critical of popular religiosity. And indeed, the use of the logos spermatikos, the scattered or the sown word that they so often use is, oh, should that not write? Seem to be. Let's see. Let's try this one. Ah, yeah, better. The logos spermatikos is that principle, spermatikos, sorry. That principle by which rightly disposed pagans could criticize the false religious beliefs all around them, you see. Pagan poetry is regarded by the apologists, in spite of their use of certain passages, as shot through with falsehood. So is pagan philosophy, and certainly pagan religion. So the reason that, for instance, Socrates and Plato can be called Christians, even though they didn't know it, is because of their right use of logos spermatikos. I say this because the use of logos spermatikos since the Second Vatican Council in Roman Catholic theology has been rather free, I think, of reference to the early fathers. And it has been employed to justify and to find truth in other religions rather than being a principle of criticism of other religions. So what I'm saying is that there is here both a yes and a no. We find this, in fact, again in relationship to, for instance, Islam, where those Christians who were living within the world of Islam had to relate to certain Muslim beliefs if they were going to explain the gospel in an intelligible way to Muslims. So St. John of Damascus is quite at ease with using the Quran to explain Christian belief to Muslims. But at the same time, we find others, particularly in Byzantium and also in the West, who are very critical of Muslim beliefs because they find them to fall short of the gospel's teaching. The reformers acknowledged that human beings, through creation and in their conscience, had some knowledge of what they were to do, but they didn't know who had commanded them to do those things. And so they could not fulfill the demand in their own conscience because of their ignorance and also because of the vitiation of the will. Now, that's an Augustinian theme, recovered, of course, very much so at the Reformation, that because of the corruption of the human will, people did not know, or even if they knew, could not act on what was true and what was being demanded of them. Now, this whole debate was ignited in the last century, in the 1930s, in the debate between Bruner and Bart. You may remember that. Emil Brunner held that there was something in the natural order and in society of the will of God which could be discerned by everyone. And people could not only discern it but also act upon it. Bart, of course, what did he say, Werner, to Brunner? You're 9. That's it. Yeah, no, I can't say it like you say it. Say it again. Yeah, that's it. He's the Bart's no to Brunner. Because Bart's position was that the human will and the intellect and the whole of the human person had been so corrupted by the fall that there was nothing that human beings in their natural state could know about the natural order and about the orders of society, of family and state and so on, in terms of God's will. Oliver O'Donovan, in his work, criticizes Bart here for confusing ontology with epistemology. So what he is saying is that Bart is right in saying that we cannot know everything about God's will simply by an examination of the natural order or of human society, but that does not mean that those things don't exist. That there is an order in society, there is an order in creation that exists, even if fallen humanity has a very distorted view of it. Now, In trying to maintain this balance between a yes and a no to culture, we come, of course, to the work of Richard Niba. Some of you will know a wonderful book published, I think, in 1950, immediately in the years after the Second World War, Christ and Culture. And Niba here identifies different ways in which Christ has been thought of as relating to culture. I need to say immediately, because even some prominent scholars get confused by this, that Niba's categories are not discrete and exclusive. You can have more than one category applying at a particular time in a particular situation. So his first category is the Christ of culture or the Christ for culture. That is to say, those societies which acknowledge the truth of the gospel and seek to build their social relationships on the basis of the gospel. This is, if you like, the Christendom model. So Britain, famously or notoriously, depending on your point of view, doesn't have a written constitution. But elements of the Constitution are found, for instance, in the coronation service, the oldest piece of public ritual in the country, where the Queen or the King, about to be crowned and enthroned, promise to uphold the laws of God and the true profession of the gospel. That is saying Christ is the basis for the organization of our social life and our political life and our economic life. Were it so, of course, in modern Britain, one often says, but that is the constitutional basis still, and has not been changed. Christendom as a whole in Europe and throughout the Middle Ages and even into the modern period was organized on this basis. Nor is this simply a Western phenomenon, if you like, because other societies, Ethiopia comes to mind, or Armenia, that were explicitly organized on a Christian basis. Today, in the modern world, we find that some African societies are organizing themselves in this way, explicitly as Christian societies. Now, one of the things that needs to be said about this immediately is that such a view of Christ and culture, even such a view of Christ and culture, cannot be seen simply to be endorsing whatever is going on in that culture. Because the gospel is also a principle of bringing a critique to a culture that acknowledges it as the basis for its social life. It is not simply an endorsement, but the gospel can also be over and against, even in such a situation. Bishop Bell is not these days in great favor, but I think his criticism of the carpet bombing of German cities by the British Air Force, I was in Munich recently and I was told that the bombing of Munich was a kind of revenge because that is where National Socialism arose. Well, I mean, that's simply not good enough. So there is this Christ of or for a culture, both as a principle of criticism and as a way of organizing society. But then Niba also spoke of the Christ who is above culture, where culture is certainly seen as organized providentially, but not as able of itself to fulfill all human aspiration. So something more is needed. Revelation is needed. The sacramental ministry of the church is needed, for instance, to fulfill those aspects of the human person that culture, even if providentially organized, cannot fulfill. I mean, this is actually after St. Thomas Aquinas being the kind of standard Roman Catholic attitude to culture. And then Bishop Ray was talking about this yesterday. There is the Lutheran position, which sees a distinction between the external and the internal forum. So the external forum is, once again, can be organized according to Christian principles, and the magistrate certainly has the power of the sword, which the church does not have, to enforce law in a society. But this has nothing to do with the internal forum where the believer has peace with God through justification by faith. And even if the believer acts as a good citizen in society, that has nothing to do with salvation. Then Niba talked of the Christ who is against culture. So we come to situations where the gospel does not simply endorse what is happening in culture, but is actively opposed to it, where people have a view of culture that is indeed a no to what is happening in culture, whether in terms of beliefs or worldview or relationships or law or whatever it may be. It is, of course, possible for a culture to move from being more of the type of a Christ of or for culture to being Christ against culture. And it may be that in the modern West, in terms of what Bishop Ray was saying yesterday, that we are moving from one kind of understanding to another. Niba's final category was Christ and the transformation of culture. That is to say, when Christ comes into contact, when the gospel comes into contact with a culture, it does not leave it as it finds it. I mean, certainly this was the case with the early church and the pagan world. I mean, the church simply transformed everything that it found in the pagan world, whether that was in the treatment of female children who were often left out to die, or in the treatment of slaves, in the perpetual conflict, armed conflict that there was always around in those societies, in the worship of the emperor or the worship of the familial gods. I mean, all of those things, they were just changed out of all recognition. And this transformation still continues. Just to give you two examples, Professor David Martin, an Anglican sociologist, has done a lot of work on Pentecostalism in South America. And his point is that what liberation theology failed to do in South America, because it ignored the spiritual faculty of the South American people, Pentecostalism is doing. So what happens? A man is converted. He doesn't therefore go out every evening and doesn't get drunk. So he doesn't come back and beat up his wife. So women have a better place in society because the parents are at home, the children do their homework and so do better at school. Because people are honest, their employers trust them and they get promoted. And the whole cycle of virtue that is created, according to David Martin, which is changing not just the fortunes of the people involved, but the socio-economic situation of society itself. On the other hand, the younger American scholars, Timothy and Rebecca Shaw, who used to be Anglican scholars but now belong to the ordinariate here, and that's another story, isn't it? But that's a fact. Anyway, they have worked amongst the Dalit, the untouchable peoples in India, particularly a group called the Nadar, who were a very despised group before they became Christian. Because of their adoption of the Christian faith, their social, economic, and educational situation has changed completely. So now, in this so-called despised group, there are now more teachers, doctors, and nurses than there are in society round about, who now come to them for help. That's Christ and the transformation of culture, if you like. Archbishop David Gitari, when he was the Archbishop of Kenya, in a landmark speech to the 1988 Lambeth Conference. Were you there for the 1988 Lambeth Conference? Well, there you are, you see. So you're seriously old. I was there as well. I was there as well. David Gitari, in that speech, said that when the gospel came to his people about 150 years ago, there were some things in the culture that the gospel endorsed, that the gospel said yes to. What were they? He pointed out, for instance, that, and this has now been backed up by research, that the gospel released the creative and artistic energies of his people. It provided for spontaneity in worship. The gospel affirmed the people's desire to be together, what the Africans called Ubuntu. Then he said, secondly, there were things that the gospel had nothing to say about. What people ate, for instance. So whether you ate ugali, the staple there, or grits, the staple here, I mean, they both taste the same to me, but let that go. It didn't matter, the gospel, I mean, and this is quite important because, of course, in Islam, it does matter. I mean, what people eat or don't eat is very important, but not here. Thirdly, he said that there were some things that the gospel could tolerate for a while as a temporary measure, but not for always. And there were two examples that he gave. One was the custom among his people of women and men having separate meetings if there were to be public meetings. They couldn't have the public meetings together. Well, in time, people would see, in terms of the implications of the gospel, that women and men also needed to meet. The other example, very controversially, that he gave was polygamy, because the early missionaries had ruled that a polygamous man, if he wanted to be baptized, must put away all but one of his wives. And the result of that was that many of the women fell into poverty and some even into prostitution because of this. So Gitari's point was that if a polygamous man came to Christian faith with his family, they should all be baptized, but it should be made clear that this was a once-for-all provision that would not, of course, be repeated in future generations as people took on the implications of the gospel. And then finally, Gitari said there were some things that the gospel was opposed to, that the gospel said no to from the very beginning. What were they? Well, he gave two examples. One was cattle rustling. Some of the people in that part believed that all the cattle in the world belonged to them. So if they stole your cow, it couldn't be stealing because it belonged to them anyway. Interesting way of looking at property, but there we are. I hope no one here believes that sort of thing. The other was the practice of killing twin children. So having twins was regarded as a curse. And the twins would be killed. Well, of course, the Christian faith could not countenance that at all in any way whatsoever. Now, Guattari has been criticized for some of these things, and we can discuss the criticisms if you wish later on. The other African scholar in this area is Professor Lamine Sane, who is a Muslim convert from West Africa, is now a professor at Yale, was a Presbyterian friend of Anglicans, and is now a Roman Catholic friend of Anglicans. But Lamine Sane's original work was on what the translation of the Bible into various African languages did to African societies. So it wasn't just that the Bible was made available in that language, but it actually changed everything about that society. And he calls this the translatability of the gospel or of the Christian faith. And he says that as opposed to Islam, which is his background, the gospel is intrinsically translatable. And he finds this, for example, seen already in the fact that the New Testament that we have is in Greek and not in the language of Jesus and of his disciples in Aramaic. In fact, the New Testament translated back into Aramaic or Syriac for about 100 years after the events described in the New Testament. The Old Syriac is about 150 AD. What Sane is saying as a result of his study of African societies is that there is something in the gospel that can always be rendered in terms of the thought forms, the idiom, etc. of any people, anywhere, at any time, if you like. This constant interaction with culture of the gospel was noticed by a man who was then called Ratzinger. In the 1990s, Cardinal Ratzinger addressed a very large conference of the bishops of Asia, in which he said that, first of all, we must not imagine that the gospel comes naked to a culture. The gospel actually comes clothed with those missionaries who have already been transformed by it. And they bring with them their own testimony and the testimony of the whole church to bear on a particular culture. Secondly, that testimony changes the culture. That testimony changes the culture, but not so as to destroy it. This is a false charge that has been made, of course, about Christian missionaries by alleged anthropologists and others, not to change the culture, but to enable the culture to find its true center. That is what the gospel does, according to Ratzinger, as he was at that time. Now, he repeated all of this after he changed his name to Benedict in the so-called, again, famous or notorious, depending on your point of view, Regensburg lecture, which became notorious for his remarks about Islam, but actually most of the lecture is about the relationship of the gospel to culture, and should be read and evaluated in that way. Behind this lies a whole story since the Second Vatican Council of a wrestling with culture. So already Paul VI in Evangelii Nuntiandi points out that when the gospel comes into contact with culture, there is a transformation in the culture. This is further developed by John Paul II in his encyclical on St. Cyril and Methodius, Slavorum Apostoli, in which he says, he goes one step further, he says, yes, the coming of the gospel to the Slav people changed the Slav people. I mean, you've been to Russia. Well, I mean, we know what, how fundamental that change has been to Slav mentality. But, he says, the coming of the Slavs into the church also changed the church. Well, you might say John Paul II would say that, wouldn't he? But I think it's true. It's true. What Benedict is saying, I think, is a development of these ideas. Now, what has all of this got to do with Anglicans, you will be asking? And the point is that this relationship of gospel to culture is fundamental in the title deeds of Anglicanism. So in the preface to the Book of Common Prayer, in the Articles of Religion, Article 34, for instance, we are mandated to express the Christian faith and to Christian worship in a language that people can understand. And that doesn't just mean the vernacular, though it does mean that, but it also means how Christian faith can get hooks into a particular culture, a way of life, a way of thinking, a way of celebrating, whatever it may be. As far as English is concerned, it is not an exaggeration to say that the translation of the Bible into English by Tyndale and others more or less created the English language as we know it. I mean, we cannot think of a Shakespeare or a Milton or a Herbert, certainly, without that translation. And whatever else we may say of the medieval church, and there are many good things to say about it, the signal failure, even by people like Erasmus, and Thomas More, and John Fisher, my predecessor at Rochester, to have the Bible translated into English is something that has to be taken seriously. And the translation of the liturgy into the vernacular, with its gains and its losses, and there were gains and losses, again, Cranmer's achievement is something that we continue to celebrate, not because we like Cranmer, but because it is without parallel. Without parallel. So it's wonderful to hear it being celebrated in your church here. However, Anglicanism has not always been loyal to its title deeds in this as in other matters. So there has been a tendency, for instance, in many parts of the world to maintain a kind of Englishness, even if the culture is demanding something different. I mean, I remember the church in Nigeria, for instance, even in the late 1980s, early 90s, when it was so staid and so prayer book and so Anglican that it was difficult to believe. And then came the challenge of Pentecostalism. And now, of course, the church in Nigeria is very different. You know, whatever you say about it. Similarly, in other parts of the world, in East Africa, the East African revival made the cultural demand of Anglicanism, which it has only partially met, I think, so far. And the question is, how is Anglicanism going to relate to different cultures as the churches are rooted more and more in those cultures? There will be this struggle between what your own theologian, William Reed Huntington, called the struggle between the principle of Anglicanism and the system. The principle and the system. We can discuss that further if you like. So, brothers and sisters, I thought we would start with Christ and culture. This afternoon, if you're all awake still, and if I'm still awake, which is more a moot point, of course, but I want to go on to why Christians should be, on the basis of what I've said, be involved in public life. But let me stop now and see if there is pushback. A sort of resigned silence, it seems.
No, I accept.
Oh.
When Pope Gregory sent missionaries to England,
Yeah.
they're very fearful and they're encountering things they haven't encountered, and ask his advice. And in Bede you can read his very openness to the culture there. I'm wondering, in the present, who should speak to those kinds of problems?